Hello and welcome to part 2 of Fractality in Time with Dan Winter and Jason Matozzo, who is with us here. And this part of the film will be more advanced. It's going to be on examples of time travel, hazards of time travel, fractionation in time, and time wars, and the quote, Templar agenda of the repair of the fabric of time. All of that sounds somewhat esoteric, but actually it's very understandable even for the layperson, and that's why we're here. So I'm going to do a short review first 10 minutes or so, in which I'm going to try to check to see if you sort of got it from the part 1 on fractality in time, a review of the key themes. And then I'm going to introduce Jason, who's behind the camera and part of the dialogue, in which then Jason is going to give at least 3 or multiple practical examples of well-known time travelers and how their well-documented and corroborated evidence of time travel fits together in a timeline, and what that teaches us about fractality in time, the physics of time travel, and the astral hazards of time travel and fractionation among the timelines. What does all that mean? I mean, how does an electrical engineer talk about those things? Oops, I'm an electrical engineer, so maybe I should try talking about those things. So, all right. So in the first segment, we talked a lot about the role of the Mayan calendar as a very famous example of fractality in time, and Geoff Stray's famous book in which he showed golden ratio intervals between dozens of key events in Mayan history, showing the golden ratio fractality in time perfected nature of the Mayan calendric. And we explained, and this is really the point, that golden ratio creates an array or a grid, sometimes called heaven or plains of Sharon, which is actually the name for the infinite electron shell unpacking of monoatomic gold. It's also the Hebrew term for heaven. And Champs-Élysées, the illusion fields. All of those are names simply for a charge distribution perfected array, literally a fractal array. And we know what that means. It means the compression nodes where longitudinal waves bounce in and out of transverse and thus enable information transfer or information distribution perfection is charge distribution perfection, sounds like heaven to me. What do you think? So the point was that inhabiting that array is what the Mayans called the dream time. Jose Argüelles is famous, and directly related to what the Aboriginals called dreaming track songline. You know, you see the Aboriginals sitting there, and their eyes are closed, but they're doing something. They're consciously lucid dreaming array that they're moving the wave node at a distance. And now you know that the physics of that action at a distance is very specifically understandable as the movement of a node in a longitudinal array, what physics calls action at a distance. They call it quantum entanglement. But entanglement is an introduction to the physics of what phase conjugation perfects. And while we're on that subject, the wave shape that makes phase conjugation possible is literally the caduceus, which is the logo and symbol of Hermes Thoth, who was, quite literally we believe, according to Maurice Cottrell, the hero of Tutankhamun prophecies, proving that the Mayan plan for fractality in time, the whole Mayan calendric, came from Quetzalcoatl Veracocha, who Maurice Cottrell contends their concept of the solar time physics, the solar periodicities, the solar flare patterns. Literally, you should remember the picture of the feathered serpent is actually a picture for the pattern over time in 3D of the solar flare densities. And remember that famous lid of Palenque was a computer animation to teach us that when the solar flare patterns aren't right, ovulation is impossible. That was the point of the computer animation called Lid of Palenque, according to Maurice Cottrell. And who is the architect of that? Pakal Volcan. That is the green ancestry of Thoth, Hermes, Veracocha, Quetzalcoatl, the so-called tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed. And that Hermes, symbol for the caduceus, is now, we know, the symbol for phase conjugation, how you implode and create that array, that fractality in time, that perfect nesting. So you see how these pieces fit together, because remember, our other theme in our other films is about the return of the Nine, the Advanced Intergalactic Federation, the so-called Cedar races that I've been recording films about with Elena Denon, who are led by, oh, it's the same guy, Thoth Hermes. That guy seems to really get around, doesn't he? Wonder what he was up to. He was wandering around talking to all the indigenous peoples about their lucid dreams to inhabit the fabric of time. So what was he trying to seed here, called human soul, was that coherent ability to inhabit that array, that fabric of time. And now that's going to lead us to our next little segment here, to understand better how inhabiting the array, as in understanding the physics of ghosts, is a relatively good introduction to the physics of array inhabiting. So, for example, when these time travelers are telling us there's these periods, I think, Jason, didn't you say it was 20-year cycle in time? Every 20 years, was that Al Bielek says there's a certain window for coming back.
Yeah, it makes it easier. 20 years and 200 years is a lot easier than 1 year.
Yeah, that's what they're saying in that. So there's a periodicity in these places where time travel has a node where they're more accessible. And that periodicity has to do with the geometry of that array. And we'd like to understand that in very practical electrical terms so you can get a handle on what this means for yourself and your luciddreamteam.com. So we're going to start with the physics of ghosts. You know how ghosts always tend to return to that spot where there was that huge peak dramatic emotion. So why is the ghost always stuck in the spot where that dramatic emotion happened? The dramatic, powerful glandular emotion made an imprint on the longitudinal array of that site. And by the way, this will never be inside a metal box. No ghosts ever there, no plasma there, no orbs, no nature spirits, nothing. A metal box is going to kill all of that.
That's why ghosts are in old homes, not in new, shipping container type homes.
Exactly. Thank you. That is the point. Speaking of bioarchitects.net. So, anywho, what did we learn about the nodes in the time travel? So, first of all, remember in the physics of ghosts, the physics of why it is so famous that the plasma of Therify.net or the aura of a very spiritual person, either one would be famous for releasing a stuck ghost. Now you know, hopefully, the physics of what it is to be a stuck ghost and the way out. It's quite simple. The charge inertia of the spin array that you called your aura or your ghost or the plasma blob, Casper the Friendly Ghost, the plasma array needs to implode and collapse non-destructively and have that charge inertia converted more from the transverse up and down localized to the more distributed longitudinal array. Remember, the physics of gravity waves, according to Bearden, is the physics of those longitudinal coherent EMF, which is literally the Ba from the Ka, the Kesjan body, the rainbow light body, and the physics of successful lucid dreaming. So the ghost is stuck because failure to compress well. Failure to compress well. Remember, the black hole experience, the Heinrich-Kluve form constants, is the map to what dying people see every time. Lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral. Well, that's a rotational symmetry series to implode your DNA to enable your memory to be distributed in the array. Sometimes called communion of saints, Akashic records, collective unconscious. Let's electrical engineers have a name for that. We need more than just psychologists here. They're great, but without... we electrical engineers, everything that looks like a hammer needs a nail. No, everything looks like a nail, therefore all we have is a hammer. We only talk about electric fields because that's what everything's made of. So you're beginning to get the flavor that the leverage on that array, that place of peak emotion, created a Madeleine de Langle wrinkle in time. The wrinkle in time is the fact that the local nodes of that array were perturbed. And that information was stuck in the local nodes of that array until that ghost gets unstuck and that memory is made distributable. That's called theshareablewave.com. hi here to Shelley, our friend in Canada. So how do you get to be a shareable wave? You know, which is why you have to do compression well at death or birth or bliss. So that compression experience, which is why a successful death is a little black hole, that's an introduction, not just to getting into the array, the heaven, the lucid dream, but it's an introduction to get into the array during time travel. Remember, when Andrea, Mike Basiago, what's his name?
Basiago, yes.
Yes. When Basiago contradicted Al Bielek about the time chair, who was steering the time chair at Montauk, he said, well, no, actually, it's basically a lucid dreaming trigger. That's what that time chair was. And now, remember, so here we have Michael Sala's newest video about time travel. What a coincidence. Is this about the physics of coincidence? Michael Sala is part of the coincidence. So he's saying that the reason time travel started basically was because Tesla realized that in the huge electric field of his Tesla coil, he started having visions.
Of the past, present, and future all at the same time.
Jason's been doing his homework. It's great. So the reason vision exists in the implosion field of the longitudinal array generated by a Tesla coil, who specialized in a longitudinal array called the death ray and all his, wireless power at a distance. The only physics is longitudinal array EMF coherence. That's the physics behind it. So he was learning how to make a tube that could squirt a longitudinal array. Jason, what was that guy saying, John Titor saying about we needed to study those tubes? What did he call it? The plasma?
Not the Kepler, the Tipler.
Yeah, the Tipler tube. Thank you.
Yes.
So just to help you think about this, there's something called a Tipler tube that creates a Kerr effect.
Yes.
Yes, and Jason is supposed to ask me how that works, because Jason's going to be getting into this story of John Titor. Was it John Titor, right?
John Titor.
Yeah, he's doing his research. He's telling about his coherent time travel experiences that Jason's going to be talking about in just a minute. And he said, well, if your scientists would just study how to use a Tipler tube to create a
Kerr effect.
A Kerr effect, right. And I'm going to suggest that if you understood that physics, you could understand this plasma projectivity of time travel itself. So and I'm going to suggest to you that that is precisely the same physics of what I did a whole video on with Elena Denon on the physics of how the UFO, the extraterrestrial craft, achieved propulsion. Remember, the metaphor was useful from Star Wars. Two kinds of propulsion. The warp propulsion and, the impulse propulsion and the warp propulsion. The impulse power is simple. If you get a piezo implosive mercury vortex with a high inertia, the geometry of the cascade down the vortex of the piezo water or mercury,
which is Hanabu,
which is not just Schauberger's propulsion device, but also Hanabu and Nazi Bell and Vimana, that what happens is that as the piezo charge trajectory implodes, actually in an accurate golden spiral down that vortex, there is an optimized translation of vorticity of the transverse and an impulse, good word, right, impulse power, for that transverse inertia to be spit out like a squirt gun into a longitudinal wave right there at the center, sometimes called the vril. And remember, you can look it up, Tom Bearden's equations in his book, Gravitobiology, proving pretty well that that longitudinal propulsion, that longitudinal wave spit out is what a gravity wave is made of. All that doc is at fractalfield.com/vacuum energy. So now you know what impulse power is. You know not only how Victor Schauberger's piezo water vortex made voltage from gravity, because the implosion through that longitudinal distribution is the reason gravity exists. And by the way, we're only inviting those to listen to this video who know why an object falls to the ground. So if you're like Einstein, Stephen Hawking, or NASA, and do not know why an object falls to the ground, you're not invited to watch this film until you do. Sorry. That would be fractalfield.com/conjugate gravity. And the reason objects fall to the ground is For example, I have proven that the radii of hydrogen, Planck times integer exponential Golden ratio, are very accurately, by equation, exactly this model. Oh, it's also a model of the Earth grid. Oh, it's also a model of DNA. Oh, it's also a model of the arrangement of masses in the universe. There's a reason for that. It's charge distribution efficiency perfected. This is goldenmean.info/kit. And the only way to make entropy, self-organization, and the only way to stabilize gravity, because the implosion through to longitudinal interferometry at the center, that's where charge goes out the center, and that's the reason gravity exists and the reason an object falls to the ground. So back to our point. We were explaining the Kosky-Frost and the Tipler tube.
Yes.
So, which is the next form of, you now know, vortex propulsion, impulse power, the Mercury vortex that the Nazis' dark fleet stuck in their submarines and took over most of the solar system with enslavement until the Galactic Federation got here and booted them the hell out of here. But remember, their warning is you guys got to learn your homework about how these things work, otherwise the Drax will be back. It's more than just Arnold Schwarzenegger that's coming back. So anywho, the warp power is specifically and key to the Tipler tube, and this is maybe a final metaphor here. Visualize the axis which makes quartz, a quartz rod, piezoelectric. The quartz rod is hexagonal because the SiO2 bond, as we explained before, ratchets up a helix like a slinky, which is the reason quartz, and indirectly the reason DNA, is piezoelectric. Piezoelectric means compression on the side makes a voltage on the end. That's a phase lock between a short wave and a long wave. Actually, you could talk about the stricture. This is stricture, compression here, is converted to voltage. The reason that short wave is coupled to that long wave is because, and only because, it's a helix, a slinky. Now, the Kosky-Frost is one of them quartz crystals. It's basically a helix or slinky. Now, in the case of warp power, as Scotty got correct in Star Trek, he called it, "My, those dilithium crystals are about to blow up." What he really meant was the lithium niobate, which is called a phase conjugate crystal. And the reason it's phase conjugate is because, and remember, this is how the Kerr effect is generated in a Tipler tube. I've got this helix, the tube, and I got what's called a phase conjugate pump wave.
How is that generated?
Yeah, pumping into the side of this quartz crystal. Now, in the case of the quartz, of the Kosky-Frost, you can read about it thanks to Elizabeth Donovan, fractalfield.com/propulsion. Read the whole book, PDF, on Kosky-Frost, entitled Glimpses of Epiphany. Credit Elizabeth Bill Donovan here. You read the whole book about that is warp propulsion. And how it's generated is, the phase conjugate pump wave is a caduceus. That's the short answer. The longer answer is, the phase conjugate pump wave is exactly the same set of frequency ratios of the infrasound and the RF that drive Therify.net. You take this equation, Planck, integer times integer exponents of Golden ratio, and get this harmonic cascade, which is pure implosion, which drives Therify.net, Quantify, Plasmafire.com, 5vibes.com, and the world's most powerful Bliss binaural audio, very cheap, flameinmind.com/flameinsound. The same perfected phase conjugate pump wave. Now, if that's an RF series, that's the moment when the Kosky-Frost crystal generated, by measurement, 800 times its own weight in gravity. Also, it changed size dramatically. It's a very colorful story. And the U.S. government, apparently, according to Bill, ran around and took the book out of every library in America to hide it. Isn't it a scream? Anywho, but you need to know what warp power is because, okay, so remember, this phase conjugate pump wave is basically a caduceus. Visualize a caduceus on both sides of a slinky. We might dump in an animation here, okay? Now, the slinky means that you're squeezing the sides slightly, and the ends get bigger and smaller by a larger amplitude. The relationship between the stricture, compression versus the voltage. That's the slinky. That's the long wave touches the short wave. How you touch the mind of God. So what's happening is that the phase conjugate pump wave means that slinky's change of geometry is now an implosive caduceus. Meaning what I'm phase conjugate pumping is the longitudinal wave from the transverse on a massive long wave scale. And the reason that's called warp power is because that, they say, bends space. Well, it isn't actually bending space. It's sending a compression wave, sometimes called scalar or torsional, more accurately called longitudinal. And that's the physics of gravity. So now you understand warp power, and you're beginning to understand now why, when John Titor and the friends Jason is about to describe, they saw this little screen, right? It's like a TV screen, they said. Was that called the window? The
Looking glass.
Oh, yes, thank you. The guardians of the looking glass. So shortly after Tesla discovered this, Tesla coil is how to create literally a wormhole that you can look through and lucid dream through, and ultimately, if it's dense, time travel through. And Jason's going to explain that John Trump, who took Tesla's library, and I don't want to steal your thunder, Jason. This is your story.
Go ahead.
Jason did the homework. I want to be clear here. But you see, so there now, after Tesla gets the clue that his longitudinal pumped waves is the beginning of time travel, then John Trump Jr. became famous for all these devices which create this plasma projection, including eventually became CERN.
Yeah, the technologies that needed to be built in order to create CERN.
Yeah. And it all came from John Trump, who was the guy who took Tesla's library just after he died, which is why Trump Sr. and Trump Jr. said about his uncle.
Yeah, he knew about nuclear before nuclear.
Yeah, which is really cool. So I'm stealing Jason's thunder, so I better stop here. But I got a couple more things in my notes here. So in terms of, did you understand part one to complete the series of notes? So now you know about ghosts and time travel, lucid dream. Oh yeah, we're supposed to explain that the physics of yearning is how you navigate in that array, and the actual physics of what you do when you yearn, as in the Sufi saying, charge the battery of yearning, is your navigator, because, you know how they say, the yearning of your ancestor of their moment of death is the wind in your sails. The physics of that is instructive because it's literally how you're steering. You know, the boys in the Philadelphia experiment, they ended up stuck in the bar room they were dreaming of going to. You know, why? So their yearning was their navigator. So the other thing was, did you understand what we meant by the repair of the fabric of time? So when these possible trajectories, and Jason's going to explain that these various time travels always say, every time I time travel, a few things had changed. and point is that this begins to fractionate the array of the fabric of time, which should look like this. But if your history is fractionated, you get these various timelines, and
Mandala effect, as it's called.
Oh yeah, which is like the butterfly.
Yes.
Yes. And so this repair of the fabric of time was specifically a concept from William Buhler, the leading Templar, whose teacher was Thoth Hermes, as we've discussed, saying we need to repair the fabric of time. And he said that right after the disaster of Montauk, which we know created a tear in the fabric of time, and he said allowed a large number of parasites.
Parasitic
Yeah, in here, including what we today call the Greys, what Elena called the Nebu, and what William Buhler called the Kumar.
And if you're watching the series Stranger Things, it's the entities in Stranger Things.
Jason has fabulous movie metaphors, because so many of the movies have some real germs of truth here. Plus, it helps convey the science to young people. So, did I finish my notes? We said what heaven, planes of Sharon, Shams that we know.
Templar.
Array, dream device. Oh yeah, that Tesla field was a dreaming device. The looking glass mentioned. Oh yes. So last part of these notes, and then I'm past due to have Jason here. But last part of these notes is to remind us that when Trump, after Tesla, first introduced looking glass and the other time travel or time visioning tech, which became also Montauk, he described that the plane that I'm going to call the plane of convergence, which was like a fuzzy TV screen. And I think, was it John Titor? He said, my dad, no, it's Basiago.
Santiago, yes.
Yeah, he said, my dad said we got to jump through this fuzzy it's like a foam, and we jump through. And
Stargate.
Like a Stargate, and out the other side. And you remember in the Stargate movie, what I call the plane of convergence looked like a surface of a liquid. And I'm going to close with this thought that it is important that as a result of this film series, you have some serious concept of exactly what is happening in physics at that watery, foam-like, as you say, a shadowy TV screen, a plane of liquefaction, a plane of convergence. And you jump through there, and suddenly out you get dizzy, you feel a tingle, and at the other end, da-da-da. Well, if you had any clue as an electrical engineer of what time travel is, you darn sure must need to have some sense of exactly what's happening at that surface. This is our closing thought. So remember, if you have enough amperage in a phase conjugate pump wave, which is a broad spectral phase conjugate tuned to Planck, that plane of convergence, the reason that is a Stargate, and this was my last film, is specifically because at that plane of convergence is the moment where the compression becomes acceleration at the Planck threshold. And that acceleration, quote unquote, into time, into other harmonics of spin rotation. Remember, famous Raymond Chow proved most of the measurements of faster than light velocities were between 1.5 to 1.7 times c, which is the smoking gun, that golden ratio times the speed of light measurements are the absolute proof that I am right, and Bearden is right, about the physics of gravity being the longitudinal wave, the result of golden ratio phase conjugation. So that acceleration at that plane of convergence, that is your clue. And if you're coherent enough to inhabit that. So, anyway, I've carried on long enough. We're going to do a short pause, and we're going to switch places here. Jason, you're on.
All right. Should I pause?
Yeah, okay. So Jason has really worked to organize the timeline of these famous time travelers, which is repairing the fabric of time. Jason!
Well, okay. So, obviously, Dan did a great job of explaining things. So we're going to get more into the timeline version of this. Like, what events happened, and how do you fix those events, and how do these time travelers try to fix these events? So, I mean, we're looking at, we're going to first start with Tesla. Since Michael Salla came out with that video yesterday about Tesla, and everything starts with Tesla, we're going to start with Tesla. So, Tesla invented, or had plans for what's called a Tesla set, which you could say is the chronovisor, which you could say is the looking glass technology, right? Tesla supposedly never built the Tesla set, but it was his apprentice, Arthur Matthews, who built the Tesla set. And then when he built that Tesla set, after the death of Tesla, that's when he was visited by the Venusians. Then the Venusians told Arthur Matthews that Tesla was from Venus, and that's where you get the baby in the basket story, that Tesla was dropped off, a baby in the basket to his parents, and his mission was to create the technology which would eventually repair the fabric of time, if that's what you want to get into there. I mean, that's a very long 500,000 year repair of fabric of time agenda by the Templars via Bill Bueller. Okay? And you could read that stuff from our good friend Curtis Cooperman at hello-earth.net. You will see the book called Wall of Light by Arthur Matthews himself, who was the apprentice of Tesla. So don't say that Tesla was not a Venusian, because this is from Tesla's most trusted apprentice himself.
Now, he was famous for that. In fact, in high school, my classmates accused me of being from Venus. I talked about that so much.
Yes, so it was very, very well known at the time, but now there's a mental block of anything in regards to Tesla and Venusians.
And Elena Danaan is describing a very advanced culture on Venus, and that's been replicated.
Yeah, and Valiant Thor, if you look at Valiant Thor, he was saying that they had the same in Venus they have the same atmosphere as Earth once did. Was a very dense atmosphere that kept everything around 70, 75 degrees. Very cool, very beautiful.
Yeah, Atlanta's saying that too. Yes.
Yes. So, so we get down to Tesla in 1943 is helping with the Philadelphia experiment, right? And that's also the year that Tesla dies. Right? He dies in 1943, after the Philadelphia experiment, of course, right? Or did he die? We don't know yet. But that's up for debate. So, we have a person named John G. Trump, right? Donald Trump's uncle, and he's working for the Department of Alien Property. And his job was to confiscate all of the Tesla papers that was in his New Yorker hotel room. And we could actually show a video of the New Yorker hotel room because I've been in there. So he had two. He had one for his lab, one that he lived in. So John G. Trump event. So let's go to the page on the MIT website. You could just go on. You could type in John G. Trump MIT. Go to the MIT website, and you'll see all of his papers archived in there. So let's just log in here.
And that's the thing. And he's famous for being at the center of various plasma projection technologies, which are precedent for. That's the point.
Yes, it's a precedent for what will eventually become computers, right? And CERN, the technology needed to create CERN and particle acceleration. So if you look at the archivespace.mit.edu, and you look at John G. Trump, you're going to see that he's had developments, right, with Robert Van de Graaff.
Yeah, and the Van de Graaff generator is basically how to accelerate a particle. So we're learning about particle acceleration, and the field was from Tesla via Trump, basically.
Exactly. So we see that he's issued patents in correspondence about a sealed-off high-voltage accelerator tube, right? And these are early particle accelerators, right? So they were experimenting back then this is 1948, 1949. Right, they're issued patents about accelerating particles. So
this fits Tesla's agenda so well, because if you implode the tube, the plasma in the tube, with the right conjugate pump wave, the spitting out of a longitudinal array will be high powered. And if it's high power and coherent enough, that is what a Stargate is. So the precedent is so fitting.
Yeah, and you have a patent pending for Trump and Van de Graaff for improvement of high voltage acceleration.
All I can remember is when we were kids and we got a Van de Graaff generator and we had 500,000 volts and my hair was standing up and the whole room turned blue and my mother walked in the door. And it was a messy moment.
And this is what's going to get interesting here, because now we have a patent correspondence between John G. Trump to Robert Van de Graaff and Vannevar Bush, who was also a apprentice of Tesla.
The plot thickens.
Yes. And he's got a vacuum electrostatic X-ray generator. All the stuff that you need for building CERN and for time travel. So just so happens Trump knows Tesla. Tesla is working with the Philadelphia experiment for time travel. And John C. Trump is confiscating the papers, and then now we're making these devices, these just little devices here and there that you need in order to create a time travel device in order to create CERN. That's the point there.
Yeah, and we should say just a little teaser here that when Tesla said he wanted nothing else to do with Philadelphia experiment, and Johnny von Neumann was running the thing, and Johnny von Neumann screwed up, and basically it's an implosion effect that hides the boat from the magnetic sensing mines, and eventually it's the implosion event that hides the boat from the radar. Well, but it's just to say the perfected implosion that was like, you had to have these pairs of coils that would create a magnetic still point. And at first that's a way of hiding the boat from the mine. Then it's a way of hiding the boat from the radar. But if the implosive still point is broad spectral enough, that's called perfected phase conjugation and effectively time reversal. It's been measured in phase conjugate optics. But guess what? Tesla says, I'm out of here. You guys are messing with people. And von Neumann doesn't really get it that well. Johnny von Neumann, one of the most famous mathematicians in history. And the generator high voltage on the right side of the boat is not properly locked into phase with the generator 180 degrees out of phase with the generator on the right side of the boat. Yep. So, of course,
Yeah, so Dan's talking about the Philadelphia experiment. What happened on the boat? I mean, you should stay here because we're gonna
and why and why they got
yeah,
dizzy
and why they got screwed up.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the Philadelphia experiment. That's the you could watch the movie called what is it? The Final Countdown.
Yeah.
Right. Very good song too by Europe, but Final Countdown movie.
Adjust the camera. Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So just that camera.
Okay, I just wanted to so if I'm sitting there, we get both of us better. Okay.
So now we're going to just talk about some historical examples of time travelers. One that you could look up, and they're well documented. Dan actually knew Al Bielek very well, practically lived with him.
In Atlanta area, actually.
Yeah, so he knew Al Bielek
And
very
Preston
well.
Nichols,
And we actually know a lot of friends that knew him as well too.
yeah.
Our friend Ulf. Many people were just tripping over time travelers, right? And so in 1943 was the Philadelphia experiment, and that was supposedly used just to cloak a ship. They wanted to create an invisibility. But yesterday, when we watched a Michael Sala interview with what is his name, Basiago,
Andrew Basiago.
Andrew Basiago, he's saying that no, yes, it was for time travel. It was not for cloaking the ship. So then so that could actually be a multiverse type scenario. Al Bielek, in his timeline, they were cloaking the ship and they accidentally created time travel. Basiago is saying that no, it was for time travel. So again, just think about the multiverse, and all these new Marvel movies are talking about multiverse and splitting timelines and things like that. And we're going to get into a couple of examples of how that could be correct. I mean, we did mention the Mandela effect. Everyone's heard of that, where some people thought that Mandela died. Some people think he did not die. And how does that happen? How do a large group of people believe one thing, a large group of people believe another thing? Was there a change in the timeline, etc.? But that's irrelevant. What's relevant is that yes, fractionation of timeline is what the Mandela effect is. We are being fractionated, and it could be because we're using looking glass, and it could be because we're using time travel.
Yeah.
Okay.
We should, and actually, if I may, while you're having a conversation, mention all of the people who have affirmed the fact that too much time travel fractionates your aura, your body, your soul. So Andrea Basiago came back very convinced that most of the people involved had serious, actually fatal health problems. We know that the fractionation of the aura that results from time travel is a summary of Swaru, the Tegotan Pleiadian, who started out, and then after too much time travel came back and was caught by the Federation being AI, literally a fractionated soul, because of too much time travel. So it fractionates the array. And last quick thought about that. When William Buehler is talking about the repair of the fabric of time, he differentiates what's called the metatronic versus orotronic grid, and Jason's going to get into that. But as two different arrays, basically. But the way to think about that is the orotronic Orion grid is basically hex, tetracubic. The metatronic is basically pent, implosive dodeca. And that is the difference between hex and pent. And you know that, for example, the Flower of Life meditators are visualizing this tetracube, and it does stabilize and crystallize, but if you don't go from hex to pent at the end, then you're susceptible to parasite because you've not imploded and gotten pent. So that's the astral hygiene, to go from hex to pent at the right moment. That is more than metaphor for when we first measured octave, or tetracubic hex, harmonics in brain waves. We thought that was telepathy, the original telepaths we measured. We measured golden ratio in brain waves, that was bliss. And we thought it was different. And then the kids who can see without their eyes, they balance the hex, the octave, and the pent golden ratio cascades from alpha to beta in their brain waves. You get both. And then they can see without their eyes. And when that gets more dense, the octave cascade and the golden ratio alpha to beta gamma in the brain waves are both high amplitude. That's John Charles Moyen, whose lucid dreams became portal stargates, and it was measured, and it was replicated, and it was proven by witnesses. So that is an example of the hex versus the pent array in the grid. You start with tetracube, and then it's stable, and then you superpose dodecacosa, and then it's implosive. And that balance between those two arrays is basically an introduction to how a planet like Earth goes into the rapture experience, basically because when that implosion becomes, then lucid dreaming increases, and angry people go insane, and the ancestors rise from the dead, and the guns will melt because they had the wrong dielectric for charge compression. So this whole legend about the left behind in the rapture is introduced by the evolution of that array, what's sometimes called next dimension or next density.
Yes. And the Guardians of Looking Glass are saying in 2030 this galactic superwave, which Dan is describing, is supposed to happen.
Which is alignment with galactic equator, increasing plasma density, and when the density increases, the phase conjugation becomes more broad spectral, and the next longer wave is embedded. And if you can feel and dream that, you can feel a body bigger than the solar system.
Yes, so let's get back to the Philadelphia experiment, where probably, most likely, it all started. The time travel, the disruptive time travel, because Jean-Charles Monnier, right?
The French SSP guy.
Yes, the French secret space program survivor. He's doing it all biologically.
That's
He's
right.
not using heavy metal craft.
That's why the ETs wanted him.
Yes. So there's two ways you could do this. You could do it with your biology, and you could do it with technology. And obviously the technology is what we're focusing on, that perhaps the technology was what screwed us up. Because if we get back to the entire fractal array, that this is your DNA, this is the Earth grid, this is the solar system, etc. Our spiral arm of the Milky Way galaxy is fractionated.
It's called the Orion Arm.
Yeah.
Speaking of Orotronic.
Yeah, did we screw it up because of starting with the Philadelphia experiment?
Well, and that's what the Reverend Mothers, we had the Reverend Mothers from Dune, Pennsylvania, long story, but they always says, look at that fractionated stars in the Orion Arm, and they say, that's when we blew up too many stars in the Orion Wars.
So are we preventing the ascension of the entire galaxy because we screwed it up here on Earth?
Are we the vaccine for the Orion Wars?
And is William Bueller repair of the fabric of space-time, which is basically repairing the Earth grid, getting this back fractal, and merging all the timelines, is that going to have us ascend to 5D? Do you want to go to the 5D, or do you want to stay in 3D?
The fifth axis of superposed rotation. By the way, you can see all the Templar agenda, the repair of the fabric of time, William Bueller graphics at goldenmean.info/Bueller, Buehler. He was a hero still with it.
Yes, so let's get back into a little bit of the history here. Now, I found a really cool website. This one's called gravitywarpdrive.com. Cool name, right? gravitywarpdrive.com. And in there, you'll see the timeline for the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk. So Montauk, if you're watching this show called Stranger Things, right? The hero in that is a person named Eleven, or El. They call her El, right? El,
as in
Elohim.
Those who can make the phase shift.
Yeah, so she's the one that supposedly opened the portal, right? So she's basically like the Stuart Swerdlow character, right? So they're all taking all the people that, I think you met Stuart, right?
Well, we know.
Yeah, we know he knows
Yeah.
Stuart. So they're just taking the Montauk story and making it accessible for children, and also injecting all kinds of stuff in there as well. But anyway, it's just going to make you think about opening portals and things.
Yeah.
And actually, there was an article about the other day about people, conspiracy theorists, saying that CERN is like Montauk, opening portals to other dimensions and having entities come out. That's just a theory.
Well,
but anyway,
we might want to just mention that we checked with our best physicist, Elizabeth Donovan Bill, about that. And of course, the conspiracy theory is CERN modulates the Schumann infrasound cascade, and to some extent that's been measured, but everything modulates that, and that is how bliss is generated, and we all have phase lock with the Earth grid because of Schumann cascade. It's how long trees live. But Elizabeth says one more thing. She says she believes that there will be an effect on the measurable impedance value of the vacuum from those experiments that's high amperage. And that does have risk of changing the base resonance of the vacuum coherence in our local neighborhood. And that is a serious, interesting question.
yes, so we could loop him in on maybe part 3.
Yeah, that's what. Hopefully Elizabeth will join us from part 3.
She will come in on part 3.
So the website that Jason is looking at has this timeline history of
Al Bielek and the Al Bielek's experience from the Philadelphia experiment.
Beautiful.
So it's 1943, August 13th, 1943 was the Philadelphia experiment. So, Al Bielek, we're going to just say Al Bielek. We're not going to say that his former name was his Ed Cameron, right? Or Duncan. He was Duncan.
He was Duncan's half brother.
Okay, so he was Ed Cameron.
That's
okay.
right. Yeah, Duncan
so
Cameron. Yeah.
They're on the USS Eldridge, right? They're conducting the Philadelphia experiment, and boom, they're in 2137. They time traveled all the way to 2137, and they're there for a few weeks, right? And
But they said it was kind of AI dominated, didn't they?
That wasn't in 2137. That was when it was 20. They went to Al Bielek himself went to 27.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So
all right, go ahead.
2749. So anyway,
continue. Yeah.
they go to 2137. They go to 2137. And then they go from 2137 to 1983 to Montauk, and von Neumann is there waiting for them.
The famous mathematician, who
Yes.
some people say the reason he went crazy was because he tried to fix Montauk. That's a widely reported. Certainly, his demise was related to Montauk.
So really, the real point is that they're in 1943 and they screw up the time travel experiment, and then they end up in 2137. And then from 2137 they have to go, and then they end up in 1983 in Montauk. So in Montauk they already have the equipment, they already have the time travel equipment there ready for them, and saying, hey, we need you to go back and turn off those diesel generators on the ship, because the time bubble that's being created on the USS Eldridge could engulf the entire
could
Earth.
melt down the whole joint, man.
Yeah.
It's like the whole environment of the Earth is in danger of imploding out of. And so there's this huge high voltage arc, which Al Bielek describes very well. I was actually with him in some of those conversations. And this is still burning, and the time travelers, like decades later, have to send them back in time or else.
Yeah, so all he's doing is shutting off the diesel generators. Now, it's two generators that are, what, out of phase or in phase?
That's what
Yes.
Elizabeth Donovan believes was the problem was the phase lock. You need precise 180 degrees out of phase from conjugate waves from opposite directions. And you got to get the alignment, for example, in lasers. It's got to be angstrom level accuracy for that implosion. And of course, on the Philadelphia ship, they didn't get it right at all.
So the point is that you have two.
That's right.
So, and John Teeter calls those micro singularities, right? So when we get back to John Teeter and how his time travel device works, he's using a time travel device built by General Electric, right? And it creates two micro singularities, which they're able to phase lock and then find out what time you want to go back in time. Kind of like the DeLorean and Back to the Future.
The flux capacitor.
Yes.
And so remember, two microsingularities is literally two pine cones kissing noses. Where have we heard that before?
Yeah, so we're going to wrap up Al Bielek's story right now, because towards the end of his stay in 2137, right, Al is going, he goes to 2749, and that is an AI-dominated culture. Now, if you see what's going on right now, we have these quantum AI computers, right? Supposedly this Google AI is now sentient, and at some point in time in Al Bielek's timeline in 2749, he was saying that they turned on AI to govern society.
Yeah,
So
it's like the Umites, man. The central AI says it's your day to die. Prepare. You have no choice.
yeah, and there's a lot of different. You probably have watched many movies. There's lots of newer movies that are out there about an AI-dominated culture.
It ain't good.
Yeah, they're saying, okay, you're gonna die this time.
Your hive mind computer just told you what. And remember, it's all soulless.
Yes.
Just like everyone in the culture is saying, do the vaccine, get the implant. You don't need a soul. Well, until they know what a soul is. And so that's the point about, and we should mention here, remember, the context here is, I'm going to mention Alex Collier Andromeda prediction. So,
Yes.
so this is to mention when the timeline got most messed up, specifically, is Andromedans saw a wave of radiating chaos messing up the whole galactic sector 300 years in the future. They travel back in time to get to this key moment when that mess started, arrived at Earth in the solar system at the time when Eisenhower got sucked by MJ-12 into signing a contract with the wrong ETs, the Nebu Gray Dracos, And that contract, remember, millions of humans then got eaten and enslaved as messy. And so the Galactic Federation didn't come back here to kick out the Greys and the Dracos and the Nazi Dark Fleet just for the Earth. There was a whole line of radiating chaos raiding their whole galactic sector. They came back in time to fix it. But what they're saying is that we have to understand the astral hygiene of that fix to keep our solar system from parasites.
Yes.
And that's about what this conversation
That means
is.
don't get the brain chip.
It means
That's 100% what it means. Don't get the brain chip. Learn how to improve your own aura. You could get flameandmind.com, right?
follow your bliss.
Get a Muse 2 headset, and then you could kind of figure that out for
and
yourself.
create your own flame. And it
Yeah.
also means don't let the Greys trick you into saying, oh, well, our race needs you, and then don't into their hybrid program, because they don't know what a soul is. They can't lucid dream either. So as Elena Denon and Marina Sarin are very clearly explaining how tricky the Grey, Draco, the Greys, and the Khmer were in trying to insidiously rebreed themselves back in here. We have to understand this hygiene of how we create this coherence bubble to keep out interstellar galactic parasites. Again, one of the agendas for luciddreamteam.com.
Yeah, so we're going to get into now the John Teeter story. John Teeter, however you want to say that last name, which is probably just an acronym of some sort. But he's talking about CERN here. And, he's saying that, he's talking about CERN back in 2000 and what they're going to be creating, etc. So I think the real point here is how his timeline went. So John Teeter supposedly is coming from 2036. In his world line, Russia bombed strategic targets in the United States. And Russia is supposedly working with the good faction within the United States in order to take out the bad guys within the United States. So if we see that now, the whole Trump-Russia collusion thing, everyone was being Russia, and it's a whole big mess, right? But supposedly, if you're in the whole Q conspiracy thing, Russia might be the good guy, but we don't really know yet. But anyway, and we're just talking about John Titor's timeline and how that went. And they were saying the exact, this is in 2000 he's saying this stuff, right? So in 2000, and the message boards, he's talking about, in his world line, right? Now think about 2000, that people are playing music together and they're sharing videos on the internet. Now that he's talking about YouTube back in 2000, and basically what most young people are doing now. They're not listening to the latest crap that's on television. They're listening to their own music that they're making and they're sharing it and things. So he's describing that pretty accurately. He also describes, now this we're just gonna go on his timeline. He said, don't kiss anyone and don't have sex with anyone that you don't know, because there's a big problem in his timeline of what we say, what he's describing as like a mad cow disease, which is the effects of the vaccine that we see now, which has the prion crystals in there that's growing prions in the brain, which is not good. It's also in the internal organs as well and everything. So maybe he's coming from a post vaccine timeline. So that's just an interesting thing to note if you want to go and read all the John Titor posts. It's at temporalrecon.wordpress.com. You can see all his posts there. But anyway, that was a little tangent, but we're going to get back to his timeline. So he comes from 2036, right? Then he's going all the way back to 1975 to the IBM engineers, because his grandfather supposedly was one of the people that were on the IBM 5100 team that made the IBM 5100 computer, which is basically a portable Unix computer at the time, right? What became Unix, which was the IBM operating system, which became Unix. Because his timeline starting around 2005, there was a civil war, right? So think about in 2005, there's a civil war. Now we don't have 64-bit computers, right? Because technology stopped at that point. We don't have 64-bit computers. All the 32-bit computers have an issue with Unix in 2038, where basically after a certain point in 2038, all the clocks will go back to like 1900, kind of like the Y2K problem. So obviously it's a big mess. They need all these aging systems to still be online, to have power, to have their military, etc., still be functional. So that is why he had to go back to 1975 to talk with the engineers to create a serial device interface for the 5100 to communicate with the mainframes, to change the source code, to fix the problem. And for some reason, we happen to know maybe we shouldn't say that. We just happen to know the engineers who created that, and no one else on the planet knows that. But anyway,
well, I was a systems analyst in IBM, the 73, 74, 73, 74, and 5, and I was working on the interfaces for long line communications, Detroit OT2D, Chicago, and Poughkeepsie, and that's how I knew Marcel.
And lots of coincidences here.
Yeah. So it's like, did I get sent back in the near past?
So we don't know. We have no idea. But anyway, just a very big coincidence how we just happened to stumble upon the people who made this 5100 serial device interface that does the APL and basic translation and other very old IBM languages. So if you're a computer geek, this is pretty cool for you. Anyway, so he has to go back in time to get this machine, to bring it back to 2036 in order to fix the problem before 2038. Cool. So during that time, he travels back to around 2000. He travels to 2000, and he's writing on the message boards about his experiences, right? And before he leaves, he goes back to 1998 and supposedly fixes the Y2K problem for everyone, and then he goes back to 2036. So what we're saying is John Titor's timeline is screwed up. In 2036, Civil War, nuclear fallout from nuclear bombs from Russia, very bad timeline to come from.
Armageddon.
Yeah, and he even talks about a multiverse, because he's saying every time he goes back by 20-year intervals, there's a 2.5% convergence difference in the timelines. So there's your multiverse right there, and there's your fractionating timelines right there. And how is he fractionating the timeline? Because it's he himself who's traveling back in time, creating different timelines, which is creating the fractionation in the
separation.
The fractionation in the spiral arm of the Milky Way galaxy. Supposedly, that's my theory. That's my legend. I don't know if Dan's going to corroborate that. But we have a serious problem here. Now that gets us to the Templar agenda of the repair of the fabric of space-time, and how the Knights Templar were going around creating the Earth grids. These very famous grids, and we're on. Are we sitting right now in the Michael line? Is that where we are?
Well, the Michael line from Canigou goes to Saint Michel de Quiche, which is also called the Pilgrimage of Compostela, right here, which literally means Compostela means the field effect of stars. And so that embeddability gives us a lot of leverage, and this is the line we're sitting on right now, which I use to regenerate, actually.
Yes, you do. So that is the issue here. How does the Templars, right, create these grids on the land, and on those grids on the land you have your sacred sites on those lands, and how do you create that and maintain them? Because a big issue with the Native Americans was when they created the railroads, they were breaking their old song lines.
Right. The steel track is fatal to the magnetic lines.
So once we learn how to create a proper Earth grid, right, then by creating the proper Earth grid, you're aligning the Earth with the solar system.
Implosive embeddability.
Exactly. So that's going to create, repair the fabric of time, and just by creating a fractal Earth again. And it's very simple because most of it's already done.
Yeah, we just have to understand that every time you put in a new highway or a new building, you need to check the local magnetic lines and not break them.
Yeah, and they fought like hell in Ireland because they wanted to build a highway right over the hill of Tara.
That's right. And the Hopi almost did a revolution when they wanted to put metal sewage pipes in their burial ground.
Yeah, so
Same
don't
reason.
Discount the Aboriginal tribes.
Right.
Yeah, so that's another thing, that we have a lot of people that just don't even consider any they consider them inferior. Oh, they live in mud huts. They live in...
They're lucid dreamers.
Yeah, they're the people that, with their heart coherence, pounding their feet on the land, is what's keeping us all together, or else we would all be Borg already.
They're the
So,
luciddreamteam.com.
Yes.
You can see William Bueller's pictures of the repair of that grid. He calls it the Rochelle grid, and it literally just looks like a Valentine. And he's got that mapped all over Europe, all over America. goldenmean.info/Bueller, Buehler, hundreds of images. So the Templar agenda, the repair of the fabric of time, is a very good introductory metaphor to this description now of restore that fractality.
Yeah.
The heart of that fractality is simple. It looks like a rose. And that's the center where centripetal force is enabled and negentropy is
yeah.
enabled.
So maybe, just maybe, the Green New Deal that they're touting, right, which, you know, a lot of people don't agree with, and I don't agree with it either. The Green New Deal was to remove these steel buildings and make, you know, all wood buildings, supposedly. I'm not exactly sure about it. But they don't want to make these high rises. They don't want to make the current architecture that we have now, right? If we have our own stone architecture, wood architecture, which we have plenty of, we could then create a more fractal Earth. And you could learn that all from Dan. Dan's been doing that for 30, 40 years. That's all he's been teaching about. So once we start learning a little bit more about how the Earth grid works and how we could tune the Earth grid and how you being embedded within the Earth grid means that your aura is able to sustain within the Earth grid. If you're in a building that's like a shipping container, like this is a new trend that's I find crazy, that they build a house out of an old steel shipping container. So you're basically inside of a shipping container. No, that's not what you want. Go to what's it? Biologic architecture.
Bioarchitects.net.
Bioarchitects.net, and then you learn a little bit about how this whole thing works. If you want to know more, you know, a good person that we know, Hugh Newman, right? He does the Megalithomania conference every year. So if you look at Megalithomania, and you look at all the different videos
On the grid.
on the grids and how these Earth grids and things work, then I will give you a good introduction.
And you could mention the example of Prague, which famously, the original map of Prague is literally a rose. The magnetic map of Prague is a rose, and there's fewer of those deathly metal buildings there. And I remember specifically being in Prague with Valerie and lucid dreaming much. In fact, I communicated with her ancestors, actually. And Prague is an example. The city attracts tourists and money. Mm-hmm. It's a fractal attractor because the magnetic map is a rose.
Yeah, and Copenhagen is supposed to be really beautiful as well, right?
Yeah, I've been there a little bit. But
so there's a lot. These old medieval type towns, and if you're looking at their architecture, if you look at it from above, they look like star forts, right?
Yeah, the magnetic lines are still alive. In France, for example, they call it Aix-en-Provence, which means the axes, or templed aix. So AIX is their word for the axes of the magnetic line. And if you're on the axes, then you can crown the king. Why? Because his aura has to inhabit the land, and then his emotions control the weather.
There you go.
That's the Grail. Arthur and the land are one. Whom does the Grail serve? Itself.
Yes, it wasn't the job of the pharaoh was to create the weather for.
That's right.
Yes.
That's my Tutankhamun memories. They used his blood to, and a pharaoh would be fired if he couldn't make rain, because if he couldn't make the Nile flood.
And one last thing, can we get into, or can you explain the connection between Ra and Enki?
Well, you know, at a simple level, Abra, literally means from the bloodline of Ra. Now, Ra came to just mean king in many languages, but the original term Ra, we believe, was one of the many names for Enki, who was also called Osiris, who was also called the Sufi king. There's so many names for Enki, read Anton Parks. Point being, Abram, the line of Abraham, the line of Enki, fits Thothmosis, the sons of Thoth, the lineage of Egyptian kings. So, you know, the line of Abraham. And actually, Lawrence Gardner then confirms that when he says Thoth Tehutis, his original name was Tehute, which was TWT, which is later changed to DWD. So everywhere you read the line of David in the Bible, you actually mean the line of Tehuti, who William Bueller announces is the grandfather of the Black Madonna.
Yes. So for all you people on the Q movement, and you're watching that official McAfee channel, and he's always talking about Ra. Ra is the green man, Ra is the
And Enki was green.
Enki was green, and he looked like the frog.
We
So
met the
all
green
you-
man in
all you-
Portugal. In Sydney,
all
we
you,
met him.
yeah, and all you QAnon people with your Kek and all that kind of stuff, you're talking about Ra, you're talking about Thoth, and you're talking about the repair of fabric of time. That's what you're really talking about.
The Caduceus.
There.
Right.
So,
yes. The raw
I think-
material, some of the best.
And I
ancient
think
material.
really to end this is really let's get fractal or really get dead, because you really need to understand just how, and it's not a really hard process, because I learned a lot of that from a lot of my friends like Sean Kerwin in England, how to dowse, right, that you're really good friends with, and Hugh Newman, John Martineau, John Michel, all these people who
Yes, exactly.
who kind of pioneered the reintroduction of earth energies and ley lines and magnetic lines on the earth, and how to harness those. And then you have Dan, who's been just going above and beyond. Look at his videos on the pyramids and how they're able to find the electrical pulses from the pyramids and how they work. He understands how they work, right?
Global wireless power, actually.
For global wireless power at a distance and things like that. So we could have global wireless power at a distance non-destructively. We don't need to carpet the earth in 5G and things like that.
Right.
So I think we all understand that, the people who are watching this video here, but it's really to go out and kind of teach others about these different things, because the latest iPhone is really, really cool. I have one. We all have technology. I work in technology. You were working in IBM. We love computers, right? We have to use them for what they're for. Is basically to map out this Earth grid and really create it and create a better life for us and our children. Because the things that are going on now with our children is disastrous. We're sticking them in front of iPads, before they can even talk, right? And what does that do to the visual cortex? It shrinks the visual cortex.
That's what Steiner showed, that
Yeah.
if you lose the ability to make an image inside, because you're passively in front of too much image creation externally, you lose the inner muscle to imag, to imagine. And that is the physics of creation inside your head. So that's part of learning the physics of what a soul is. Exactly.
So I think that's pretty good.
Thank you for describing the happily ever after.
Yeah.
I like Jason's passion. That's good.
All right.
Blessings, everybody.